Claire Whitmore opened her eyes to darkness and the smell of pine. Her wrists were free. Her ankles were free. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, because nothing hurt, and nothing was tied down, and the only sound in the world was wind moving through tall trees. Then she tried to sit up, and her head spun so hard she had to press both palms flat against a wooden floor to keep from falling sideways. A cabin. She was inside a cabin. The walls were rough logs, gray with age. A single window let in a slice of moonlight, and through it, she could see nothing but trees. Endless trees, stretching away in every direction as far as the glass allowed her to see. There was a wood stove in the corner, cold and dark. There was a narrow bed she was not lying on. There was a door. She remembered a parking garage. She remembered pressing the button on her key fob and hearing the double chirp of her car unlocking. She remembered a hand closing over her mouth from behind, gentle at first, almost polite, the way a person might cover your eyes as a surprise. Then nothing. Then this. Claire pushed herself up on shaking legs and crossed the room to the door in 4 unsteady steps. She turned the handle. It opened. She stood frozen, staring at the black gap between the door and its frame, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. No trick came. The door swung wider under her hand, and cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and old leaves. "You can go, if you want." The voice came from a chair in the far corner of the room, a chair she had not noticed because it sat outside the moonlight. A man was sitting in it, with his ankles crossed, as calm as someone waiting for a bus. She could not see his face clearly, only the shape of him, broad shoulders, dark jacket, hands resting loose on the armrests. "Who are you?" Claire said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Daniel," he said, as if that answered everything. "The forest goes on for about 11 miles in every direction before you hit a road. I'd start now, if I were you. The nights are shorter than you'd think." She did not understand. She stood in the doorway, with the wind pulling at her hair, and tried to make sense of a man who had taken her from a parking garage and was now, apparently, inviting her to leave. "You're lying," she said. "I'm not." He did not move from the chair. "Go on." Doors open. For 3 full seconds, Claire waited for him to laugh, to stand, to do something that explained the joke. He did none of those things. He simply watched her with the patient stillness of a man who had done this before, and knew exactly how it would go. So she ran. She did not look back to see if he was following. She crossed the small clearing around the cabin in a sprint, her shoes sliding on wet grass, and plunged into the tree line with her arms up to shield her face from branches she could not see coming. The forest swallowed the moonlight almost immediately. Within 20 steps she could see only shapes, black on black, trunks rising up out of the ground, like the legs of enormous animals. She kept running anyway. Running felt like the only sane thing left to do. Her lungs burned within minutes. She had never been much of a runner, and the ground here was not flat pavement, but a maze of roots and fallen branches, and soft patches of leaf litter that gave way under her weight without warning. Twice she went down, hard, catching herself on her palms both times, and both times she was back on her feet before the pain had a chance to register. She thought about her sister, Margaret, who would be expecting a call tomorrow. She thought about the meeting she was supposed to have at 9 in the morning, the one she had actually been looking forward to. She thought about how strange it was that a mind under this much pressure would waste time thinking about a meeting. Behind her, far off, she heard nothing. No footsteps, no voice. Just wind, and her own breathing, and the occasional creak of branches settling. Maybe he wasn't following at all. Maybe this was some kind of test, or a sick joke that ended the moment she was out of sight. And any minute now she would break through the trees and find a road, a house, a stranger with a phone. She ran until her legs would not carry her at that pace any longer, then slowed to a fast, stumbling walk, one hand out in front of her to catch branches before they caught her. She had no sense of direction. She had chosen a line and stuck to it, on the theory that a straight path would get her somewhere faster than wandering, but with no landmarks and no stars visible through the canopy. She could not have said whether she was still moving in that same line, or had drifted into a slow circle. A twig snapped somewhere to her left. She stopped dead, breath caught in her throat, and listened. Nothing. An animal, probably. She made herself start walking again, faster now. telling herself that fear was making her hear things. Another sound, closer this time. Not a twig. Footsteps, unhurried, moving through the undergrowth with none of the frantic crashing she herself was making. "You're doing well," Daniel's voice said, from somewhere behind and to the right, not loud, almost conversational, as if he were commenting on her form at a gym. "Most people go in circles within the first 10 minutes. You've kept a fairly straight line." Claire spun toward the voice and saw nothing but trees. She backed away from where the sound had come from, and immediately regretted it, because now she had lost her sense of which direction she had originally been walking. "Stay away from me," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded against the size of the dark around her. "I'm not stopping you," he said. His voice had moved again, further off now, or perhaps just quieter. "Keep going, really. I mean that." She kept going. She had no other choice that made sense to her. She pushed through a stand of low bushes that scratched at her arms and legs, came out into a small open space where the canopy thinned and she could see a scatter of stars, and used them for the first time to try to orient herself, though she had no idea, standing there, which direction meant safety, and which meant deeper into wherever this was. She chose a direction and walked. For a long stretch, perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps longer, she heard nothing else. No footsteps, no voice. Only her own labored breathing, and the wind moving high in the treetops. Her heartbeat began to slow, from a hammering panic, into something closer to determination. She started to believe, cautiously, that she had actually put distance between herself and the cabin, between herself and him, and that if she just kept walking in a reasonably straight line, she would eventually reach the road he had mentioned, or a house, or anything with electricity and other people in it. Then the ground dropped away in front of her without warning, a shallow gully hidden by leaves, and she went down hard, rolling, and came to a stop against the base of a tree with her ankle twisted underneath her, at an angle that made her cry out before she could stop herself. She lay there for a moment, breathing through the pain, testing the ankle carefully. Not broken, she thought. Badly wrenched, but not broken. She could still stand on it, though every step sent a sharp line of pain up through her leg. She was still sitting against the tree, catching her breath, when she heard him approaching from directly ahead of her, unhurried footsteps in the leaves, and understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that he had not been following her at all. He had known exactly where she would end up. "There you are," Daniel said, stepping into the small patch of starlight where she sat. He crouched down a few feet away, forearms resting on his knees, studying her with an expression that was almost gentle, almost sympathetic, as if he genuinely felt sorry that she had hurt herself. "That gully catches almost everyone. I should probably fill it in one of these days." "How did you—" Claire started, and stopped, because she did not actually want the answer. "I know this forest," he said simply. "Every part of it. I've had a long time to learn it." He stood and offered a hand down to her, which she did not take. After a moment he let it drop. "Can you walk? I'll help you back. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have much choice, with that ankle." He said it without menace, the way a person states a fact about the weather. "But you're welcome to try walking out on your own. The offer's real. It's always real." Claire pulled herself up against the tree trunk, testing her weight on the injured ankle, and managed 3 limping steps before the pain made her stop, gasping, one hand braced against bark. Daniel watched her without moving to help, without moving to stop her either, simply watching, the way someone might watch weather roll in, something to be observed rather than argued with. "Why?" she finally asked, when she had gotten her breath back enough to speak. "Would you let me try to escape at all? Why not just keep me locked up?" For a moment he did not answer. When he did, his voice had lost some of its earlier calm, and something underneath it, something she could not name yet, came through instead. "Because you deserve the chance," he said. "Everyone should get the chance to run." It was, Claire would think much later, the most frightening thing he had said to her yet, and she would not fully understand why, until she had spent many more nights in these woods, learning the particular shape of his patience, and the particular shape of her own fear, and the long, dark distance that still separated her from anything resembling home. Daniel carried her back to the cabin without asking permission, and Claire was in too much pain to refuse the help she had rejected only minutes before. He walked steadily, unbothered by roots or slopes that she would never have found in the dark on her own, and she realized somewhere along the way that he was not simply strong. He was following a path, an actual path, one that existed only in his memory, worn into the forest floor by feet that had walked it many times before hers. Inside the cabin, he set her down on the narrow bed and knelt to examine her ankle with careful, clinical hands, pressing gently along the bone, watching her face for signs of sharper pain. "Not broken," he said. "You were right about that. Just swollen. I'll get you something for it." "Don't touch me," Claire said, pulling her leg back, though the movement made her wince. "I'm not going to hurt you," Daniel said, and something in the flatness of his voice made the statement feel less like reassurance and more like a rule he had decided upon and intended to follow no matter what. He stood and crossed to a cabinet near the wood stove, returning with a cloth-wrapped bundle of ice, which he set on the bed beside her rather than pressing it to her skin himself. "For the swelling, elevate it if you can." Claire stared at him, for trying to understand the shape of the person in front of her. He did not look like a monster. He looked ordinary, dark-haired, somewhere in his 30s, dressed the way anyone might dress for a hike, and that ordinariness frightened her more than any obvious cruelty would have. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing you're imagining," he said. He settled back into the chair across the room, the same chair from before, and rested his forearms on his knees. "I'm not going to explain myself tonight. You're hurt, and you need to rest. Tomorrow you'll have questions, and I'll answer some of them. Some of them. The ones that matter." She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers immediately, but exhaustion was pulling at every part of her body, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the run and the fall was draining away fast, leaving her hollow and shaking. She pulled the thin blanket at the foot of the bed over herself, more for the comfort of having something to hold on to than for warmth, and watched him across the dim room until her eyes grew too heavy to keep open. When she woke, gray morning light was coming through the window, and Daniel was gone. Claire sat up carefully, testing her ankle. It was stiff and sore, but bore her weight better than she expected. She limped to the door, remembering that it had opened for her the night before, and found that it opened again now, just as easily. She stood on the threshold looking out at the forest in daylight for the first time, and what she saw took the breath out of her. Trees, not a scattered woodland with a road visible somewhere through the branches, but a true forest, dense and old, trunks wide enough that she could not have wrapped her arms around some of them, canopy so thick overhead that the morning light came down in broken pieces rather than a clean sweep. There was no fence, no wall, no visible boundary of any kind, just an open door and an entire world of trees waiting on the other side of it. She understood, standing there, that the openness of the door was not kindness. It was a message. He was telling her, without needing to say it again, that there was nowhere to run that he did not already know better than she ever could. Daniel returned an hour later carrying a canvas bag, which he set on the small table near the stove. Inside were groceries, bread, a carton of eggs, a bag of apples, ordinary things that made the whole scene feel even more surreal than if he had brought nothing at all. "You went into town," Claire said. "I go into town most days," he said, unpacking the bag without looking at her. "It's about 40 minutes each way. There's a road, if that's what you're wondering. It exists. You're just a long way from it." "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you'll find out eventually, and I'd rather you hear it from me than spend weeks assuming something worse." He set the eggs in a small icebox and turned to face her properly for the first time that morning. "There's a town. There are people in it. None of them know you're here, and none of them are going to stumble onto this cabin by accident. It's not on any map that matters. But the road is real, and if you reach it, you're free. That part has never been a trick. Then let me go there, right now. Drive me." "No," he said, simply, without apology. "That's not how this works." "How does it work, then?" Her voice cracked on the last word, frustration and fear bleeding together, until she could barely tell them apart. Daniel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in his head, perhaps with other people, in other versions of this exact room. "Every night, the door opens," he said. "You can run, if you want to. I won't stop you at the door, and I won't chase you the way you're imagining, screaming through the trees. I'll simply go looking, because that's the agreement, and I'll find you. I always find you. If you ever reach the road before I do, you're free, and I mean that completely. I won't follow you there. I won't come looking for you in town. It ends the moment your feet touch pavement." Claire stared at him, waiting for the catch, certain there had to be one. "And if you find me first, then you come back here, and we do it again the next night." "That's insane," she said. "You're insane." "Maybe," he said, without any visible reaction to the word. "But it's the truth, and it's the only offer you're going to get. I'd rather you understand the rules clearly than spend weeks trying to guess them." She wanted to hate him in that moment more purely than she had ever hated anything, and some part of her did, a hot, clean anger that made her hands shake at her sides. But underneath the anger was something colder and more useful, a small, sharp voice that told her to listen, to learn everything she could, because a man who explained his rules this plainly was a man who believed those rules would hold no matter what she tried. That night, when the light began to fail and the trees outside the window turned from green to black, Daniel stood from his chair and walked to the door without a word. He opened it, stepped back, and looked at her, with an expression that held no cruelty in it, which somehow made the moment worse. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Claire's ankle still ached, a low, constant throb that reminded her with every step of how close the ground had come to breaking her the night before. She thought about staying, about refusing to play whatever game this was, about simply sitting in the cabin and denying him the satisfaction of a chase. But the thought of doing nothing, of accepting even one more hour of this as inevitable, was worse than the fear of the trees. She stepped through the door and ran. This time she paid closer attention to everything: the slope of the ground beneath her feet, the position of what little sky she could see through gaps in the canopy, the sound of her own footsteps, and how far they might carry. She chose a different direction than the night before, angling away from where she remembered the gully had been, and forced herself to move at a pace she could sustain, rather than the panicked sprint that had exhausted her within minutes. For a long while there was nothing but trees, and her own breathing, and the distant call of some night bird she could not identify. She began, despite everything, to feel something close to hope. If she could just keep a clear head, keep moving steadily instead of blindly, perhaps this time would be different. Then, far behind her, she heard him. Not shouting, not crashing through brush the way she was. Just footsteps, patient and unhurried, moving through the dark with the ease of a man walking a route he had memorized years ago. The sound did not seem to be getting closer, exactly, but it also never seemed to fall away, no matter how much distance she believed she was putting between them. She thought about Margaret again, about how her sister would already be calling, already be worried, already be doing whatever a person does when someone they love simply vanishes. She thought about her own apartment, the mail piling up, the plants she had watered only yesterday morning, in a life that now felt impossibly far away. She ran, until the trees blurred together into a single dark wall on every side, until her lungs burned, and her ankles screamed with every step. And somewhere in the deepest part of that run, she made herself a promise. She would learn this forest. She would learn his patterns, his habits, the particular rhythm of the game he had built around her. And one night, she would use everything she learned to walk out onto that road herself, whatever it cost her to get there. Behind her, unhurried, Daniel kept walking, and somewhere in the dark between them, the second night of the chase had already begun. He found her that second night, beside a fallen log, curled into the space where the trunk had split apart, trying to make herself small enough to disappear into the wood itself. She had run for nearly 2 hours before her strength gave out, and when his footsteps finally stopped a few feet from her hiding place, she felt something close to relief, mixed in with the despair, simply because the waiting was over. "Clever spot," Daniel said, crouching down to look at her. "Better than most people manage on their second night." "Stop talking like this is a competition," Claire said, her voice raw from exertion and cold. "It is one," he said, and for once there was no calm distance in his voice, only something quieter and more honest. "You're better at this than you think you are. That's not a compliment I give lightly." He walked her back without another word, and this time she noticed things she had missed the night before, worn patches in the undergrowth that suggested a trail, a specific angle at which he moved that told her he was following landmarks invisible to her. a particular whistle of wind that seemed to change pitch near a slope on their left, which she filed away as something to remember. Over the days that followed, a strange and uneasy rhythm settled over her life in the cabin. Mornings, Daniel brought food and said little. Afternoons, he sometimes left for hours at a time, and Claire used those hours to search the cabin from corner to corner, looking for anything useful: a phone, a map, a weapon, a key to some door that did not exist because there was no need for a locked door in a forest 11 miles wide. She found none of those things. What she found instead, tucked behind a loose board near the wood stove, was a small brass compass, its glass scratched but its needle still steady, and a folded paper map so old and worn that half its markings had faded into illegibility. She hid both items inside the lining of her jacket and said nothing about them. That night, the third night, she used the compass for the first time, checking her direction every few minutes instead of simply running blind, and it changed everything about how the chase felt. She was no longer stumbling through darkness hoping for luck. She was moving with purpose, holding a straight bearing toward what she guessed, from the faded map, might be the general direction of the road. She lasted almost 3 hours before Daniel's footsteps found her again, but in that time she had covered more ground with more control than either of the previous nights combined, and when he stepped out of the trees to find her standing rather than hiding, breathing hard but steady on her feet, something shifted in his expression that she could not quite name. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. Claire said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Good," he said, after a moment, and the word surprised her so much that she almost missed what came after it. "I'd rather you fight this properly than just run in circles until you give up. Keep whatever you found. I won't take it from you." "Why would you say that?" she demanded. "Why would you want me to have an advantage?" "Because an easy chase isn't worth anything," Daniel said, and turned to lead her back toward the cabin, before she could ask him what that meant, or why a man who claimed to want her to win kept finding her every single night regardless. The fourth night, she tried a different strategy entirely. Instead of running as far and as fast as she could the moment the door opened, she waited nearly 20 minutes inside the tree line, watching the cabin, trying to see which direction Daniel walked when he finally came out to begin his search. She had reasoned, lying awake the night before, that if his search always began from the cabin itself, understanding his starting point might tell her something about how he moved through the forest, some pattern she could use against him. What she saw confused her more than it helped. Daniel did not simply walk into the trees at random. He paused on the porch for a long moment, head tilted slightly, as though listening for something specific, and then set off at an angle that seemed almost too precise to be guesswork. He is tracking me, she realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Not just chasing, tracking, reading the ground, the broken branches, the marks I don't even know I'm leaving. That knowledge terrified her and steadied her in equal measure. If he was reading signs, then she could learn to hide them. She spent the rest of that fourth night moving with deliberate care, choosing harder ground where her footprints would not show, avoiding low branches that might snap and betray her position, doubling back once along a shallow stream to break whatever trail she might have left. It cost her time and speed, but when Daniel finally found her, well past midnight, crouched in a hollow beneath an outcrop of rock, he looked, for the first time, genuinely surprised. "You backtracked through the water," he said. "You said you'd rather I fight this properly," Claire answered, too exhausted to feel any satisfaction in the moment, though some small part of her noted it anyway. He studied her for a long moment in the dark, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he nodded once, as if she had passed some test he had never bothered to explain to her. "You're learning fast," he said, "faster than most." The word most sat uneasily in her chest as they walked back toward the cabin, and Claire found herself turning it over in her mind, long after they returned, long after Daniel had retreated to his chair, and she had curled beneath the thin blanket, feigning sleep while her thoughts raced. Most, as if she were not the first, as if this forest had swallowed other names, other faces, other women who had run through these same trees on other nights, learning the same lessons she was learning now, before their stories ended in ways she did not yet know and was afraid to imagine. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she lay very still, listening to the wind outside the window, and began, piece by piece, to build a plan that was no longer just about running fast or hiding well. It was about understanding this place, and this man, well enough to finally walk out of these woods and never look back. The word most stayed with Claire for days, working its way into every quiet moment, until she finally decided to ask him about it directly. She waited until an afternoon, when Daniel sat at the small table, cleaning a hunting knife with slow, methodical strokes of a whetstone, an activity that seemed less like a threat and more like habit, the way another person might tap a pen against a desk while thinking. "How many?" she asked, and did not need to say more than that. His hands stilled on the blade for a moment, before resuming their slow, even strokes. "That's not a question I answer. Because the number is too high, or because you're ashamed of it." "Because it doesn't help you," he said. "Knowing a number won't teach you anything the forest can't teach you better. Focus on what's in front of you, Claire. That's the only thing that's ever mattered here." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it in his voice sent a fresh wave of dread through her, because it meant he had learned it somewhere, from a wallet or a phone or some paperwork she had never seen him touch, and it meant that to him she was not simply an anonymous shape running through the dark. She was a person he had chosen, specifically, deliberately, for reasons she still did not understand. She did not ask about the number again, but she began, quietly, to study everything else about him instead. She noticed that he left for town on a fairly regular schedule, roughly every third day, always in the late morning, always gone for close to 2 hours. She noticed that he never brought a weapon with him on the nightly searches, at least none that she ever saw, which told her something about how certain he was of his own advantage in these woods. She noticed the particular creak of the third porch step, the way he always paused there for a beat before continuing, and filed that away along with everything else, uncertain which pieces might eventually matter. On the fifth night, she tried something entirely different. Rather than running in a straight line away from the cabin, she circled it first, moving in a wide loop through the trees, trying to map as much of the immediate area as she could before committing to a direction. It was slower and riskier, because it meant staying closer to the cabin for longer, but it gave her a clearer sense of the terrain than any previous night had. She discovered, on that loop, a narrow game trail that ran along a low ridge to the east, worn smooth by the passage of deer or other animals, firm enough underfoot that it would not betray her steps the way the softer ground elsewhere did. She followed it as far as she dared, before turning to make her real run for distance, and for the first time she felt she understood, in some small way, the shape of the land around her, rather than simply reacting to it in panic. Daniel found her later than usual that night, past 2 in the morning, and when he did, his first words were not about the chase at all. "You found the ridge trail," he said, and there was something almost like approval in it, though wrapped in an exhaustion she had not expected from him. Not many people find that on their own. "You sound tired," Claire said, surprising herself with the observation. "I am," he admitted, sitting down heavily on a fallen log, a few feet from where she stood, catching her breath. "You're making me work for this. That's rare." She studied him in the moonlight, this strange, calm, terrifying man who spoke about hunting her through the woods the way another person might discuss a difficult crossword puzzle, and something occurred to her that she had not considered before. "You want me to escape," she said slowly, testing the idea even as she spoke it. "Not easily, not without earning it, but you want it. That's why you keep telling me things, why you let me keep the compass, why you sound almost proud when I find something new." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring off into the dark trees rather than at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat calm it usually carried. "I want to know if it's possible," he said, "that someone could actually do it. Actually get all the way to that road, on their own skill, against everything I know about this place." He shook his head slowly. "It's never happened, not once. I've started to wonder if it can." "Then let me go now," Claire said, seizing the opening. "If that's really what you want, prove it. Let me walk to that road in daylight, with nothing chasing me." "No," he said, and the calm returned to his voice instantly, as though a door had closed somewhere inside him. "That's not the same thing. It has to be earned in the dark, against me, or it doesn't count for anything." He stood, brushing off his jacket, and gestured for her to walk ahead of him back toward the cabin. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength." Claire walked in silence, turning his words over in her mind, trying to decide whether she had just learned something valuable about the man holding her, or whether she had simply been given a more elaborate version of the same trap, dressed up in language that made it sound like fairness. Either way, she understood one thing clearly now, more clearly than she had understood anything since the night in the parking garage. Daniel was not simply cruel. He was searching for something in these woods that had nothing to do with her at all. Some proof about himself, some answer to a question that had probably driven him to build this entire twisted arrangement in the first place. And if that were true, then perhaps the way out was not simply to outrun him, but to become, in his eyes, undeniable proof that the answer he was looking for existed. That night, lying in the narrow bed while he sat in his chair across the room, staring at nothing, Claire began to plan in earnest, no longer thinking only about the next run, but about the entire shape of the forest, the entire shape of the man who ruled it, and the precise combination of patience and daring it would take to finally walk free. Over the next several nights, Claire changed her approach again, and this time, the change was subtle enough that she hoped Daniel would not notice it for what it was. Instead of trying to outrun him or outhide him, she began to study his search patterns with the discipline of someone memorizing a language. She noticed that when she ran east, toward the ridge trail, he seemed to find her faster, as though that direction were more familiar to him, more heavily walked. When she ran north, into a denser, wetter section of forest full of low, tangled brush, he took longer, sometimes considerably longer, and twice she managed to hide successfully for more than 3 hours before he found her. North, she decided, was where his knowledge was thinnest. North was where her real chance would have to be built. She spent her captive afternoons, when he was not watching closely, tearing small, careful strips from the edge of the old paper map and marking them with whatever she could find: a burnt matchstick for charcoal, a thorn for scratching faint lines into softer paper, building her own private version of the terrain to the north, updated each time she returned from a night's run with some new detail: a fallen tree here, a steep drop there, a place where the ground turned suddenly to loose shale that would announce her presence with every step. She also began, without fully admitting it to herself, to study Daniel. He was not a simple man, whatever else he was. In the mornings, before his walk into town, he sometimes stood on the porch for long minutes, watching the trees with an expression that looked less like satisfaction and more like something close to grief, though grief for what she could not begin to guess. Once, she woke in the gray hour before dawn to find him sitting at the table with an old photograph in his hands, and though he put it away the instant he noticed her watching, she had seen enough in that brief glimpse to know it was not a photograph of her. A young woman, dark-haired, smiling at whoever held the camera, in a place that did not look like this forest at all. She never asked him about it. She was afraid of what the answer might do to whatever fragile balance existed between them, a balance she was only just beginning to understand well enough to use. On the 9th night, Claire ran north with everything she had learned so far, moving carefully along the edges of the denser brush, rather than crashing straight through it, using the game trails she had mapped, avoiding the loose shale she had marked days before. She lasted longer than she ever had, well past 3 hours, deep enough into unfamiliar ground that even her own careful map ran out of detail, forcing her to rely on instinct and the compass alone. She was standing in a small clearing, catching her breath, trying to decide which way to move next, when she heard something that was not Daniel's footsteps at all. A different sound, an engine, distant but unmistakable, the low mechanical growl of a vehicle, moving along some road she could not yet see. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had never heard that sound before, not once in 9 nights of running, and it meant only one thing. She was closer to the road than she had ever been. She moved toward the sound immediately, abandoning caution in favor of speed, crashing through brush she would normally have avoided, driven by a hope so sudden and so sharp it felt almost like pain. The trees began to thin ahead of her, the canopy opening in patches that let real moonlight through for the first time, in what felt like hours, and somewhere beyond the next rise, she was certain, lay the edge of the forest itself. She was almost to the top of that rise when her foot caught on a root hidden beneath a drift of leaves, and she went down hard, the compass flying from her hand and skittering away into the dark, lost instantly among the undergrowth. She scrambled to find it, patting desperately at the ground, but the leaves were thick and the dark was absolute. And after a full minute of frantic searching, she understood, with a sinking feeling that settled into her chest like a stone, that it was gone. She kept moving anyway, using the sound of the engine as her only guide now, fainter than before, perhaps already fading as whatever vehicle it belonged to moved on. She reached the top of the rise, breathless, and looked down into a shallow valley on the other side, hoping desperately to see a ribbon of pavement catching the moonlight. There was nothing, just more trees, stretching down into darkness, the sound of the engine gone completely now, swallowed by distance or by the wind, leaving her uncertain whether she had truly heard it at all, or simply wanted to hear it badly enough to imagine it. She sat down hard on the crest of the rise, exhaustion and disappointment crashing over her at once, and it was there, minutes later, that Daniel found her, standing quietly at the tree line with his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she could not read in the dark. "You heard the road," he said. It was not a question. "I lost the compass," Claire said, too tired and too defeated to lie about anything anymore. "I know," he said. "I found it on the way here." He held it out to her, the small brass case catching a sliver of moonlight, and she stared at it for a long moment, before taking it back, with hands that would not quite stop shaking. "You could have kept it," she said, "made me start over without it." "That's not how this works," Daniel said, echoing words he had used once before, though this time, they carried a weight she had not noticed the first time she heard them. He crouched down beside her, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his own face now, a tiredness that seemed to run deeper than any single night's search could account for. "You were close tonight, closer than anyone's ever been." "How close?" Claire asked, though she suspected, even as she asked it, that he would not give her a straight answer. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the dark valley below them, the same valley that had failed to reveal the road she so desperately needed to see. "Closer than you think," he finally said. "Further than you hope." He stood, offering his hand to help her up, and this time, exhausted past the point of pride, she took it. "Come on, tomorrow's another night." As they walked back through the dark together, Claire found herself thinking not about the road she had failed to find, but about the way his voice had changed when he told her how close she had come. The strange note of something that sounded almost like fear, buried beneath the calm surface of his words, as if the possibility of her success frightened him in ways his careful rules and patient explanations had never quite prepared him for. Something was shifting between them, she realized, some balance tilting slowly in a direction neither of them had fully named yet, and she resolved, walking silently beside him through the black trees, that whatever it was, she would use it, the very next chance she got. The morning after the 9th night, Daniel left for town later than usual, and Claire, restless and unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, found herself standing at the small table where she had once seen him holding the photograph. She knew she should not look. She looked anyway. It was tucked inside a battered wooden box she had never noticed before, pushed back against the wall behind a stack of old newspapers. Inside, along with the photograph of the dark-haired young woman, were other things: a woman's watch with a cracked face, a folded newspaper clipping so old and yellowed it nearly crumbled at her touch, and a small handwritten note, in careful faded ink, that she made herself read only once, before closing the box, unable to bear looking at it any longer. The clipping told her enough. A name she did not recognize. A disappearance, years old, in a town whose name meant nothing to her, but whose surrounding description, deep forest, remote roads, matched this place with an accuracy that made her stomach turn. The article was short, the kind of piece written when a story has gone cold and a newspaper is filling space rather than reporting real news, and it ended with a line about the case remaining unsolved. Claire closed the box and set it back exactly where she had found it, her hands trembling, her mind racing through implications she did not want to follow to their end. Whatever this arrangement was, whatever twisted rules Daniel had built around it, she was not his first participant in this forest. She might not even be his 10th. And yet, she made herself think, forcing calm into her racing thoughts, if the clipping was truly that old, if the case had truly gone cold years ago, then something about his pattern had held for a very long time, without any of his previous captives ever reaching that road. That was the part that mattered now, not the horror of what had come before, but the practical truth buried inside it. Whatever weakness existed in his system, whatever gap in his knowledge of these woods, she was going to have to be the one to find it, because clearly no one else ever had. When Daniel returned that afternoon, he seemed different, quieter than usual, and Claire wondered, with a chill, whether he somehow knew she had found the box. He said nothing about it, though, and busied himself instead with small chores around the cabin, refilling the woodpile, checking the seal on the window, tasks that felt almost deliberately mundane, as though he were trying to anchor himself in the ordinary, after some private storm she could not see. It was during one of these quiet chores, while he knelt by the woodpile stacking split logs, that Claire noticed something she had somehow missed in all her previous days of careful observation. A faint white scar ran along the inside of his forearm, old and long-healed, the kind of mark left by something sharp dragged deliberately across skin, rather than an accidental injury. She said nothing about it, but she filed it away with everything else, another small piece of a picture that was slowly, painfully coming into focus. That night, before the door opened for her 10th run, she asked him a question she had been building toward for days. "The others," she said, "did any of them ever get close? As close as I got last night?" Daniel's hands stilled on the door handle. For a long moment he did not answer, and she thought he might refuse the way he always had before. Then, quietly, without turning to look at her, he spoke. "One," he said, "a long time ago, closer than you even, close enough to see the road itself, from the top of the ridge on the far side of the valley." "What happened to her?" "She fell," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the word, a fracture so brief Claire almost missed it. "In the dark, on ground she didn't know well enough. I found her before I could help her. It wasn't the running that stopped her. It was the forest itself." He finally turned to face her, and in the dim light, she saw an expression on his face she had not seen before, something that looked almost like an old wound reopening. "That's why I want someone to make it. Not because I enjoy any of this, the way you probably think I do. Because I need to know the forest doesn't win every single time, that it's possible to beat it." "You could just let me go," Claire said, quietly, no longer angry, simply exhausted by the strange, tangled logic of the man in front of her. "You could end this right now, without any more chasing." "I can't," Daniel said, and for the first time, his voice held something that sounded almost like genuine regret. "I've tried to explain that to myself 100 different ways, and none of them make sense outside of these walls, I know that. But it has to be earned. It has to be real, or it doesn't undo anything." He opened the door, and cold night air rushed into the room between them. "Run well tonight, Claire. I mean that more than you know." She stepped past him into the dark, her mind spinning with everything she had just learned, the box of old, sad relics, the scar on his arm, the fractured grief in his voice when he spoke about someone who had died on this same ground she was standing on now. Whatever twisted, broken reasoning had built this arrangement, she understood now that it was not simple cruelty driving him. It was something far more complicated, guilt braided so tightly with control that he could no longer tell the difference between punishing himself and testing her, and she resolved, running north into the dark once again, that she would use every piece of that knowledge, every fracture in his carefully built rules, until she found the exact place where the whole structure would finally give way. On the 12th night, running north along a route she had now traveled 3 times before, Claire heard something new carried on the wind, a sound distinct from the wind itself, distinct from the small creatures that occasionally rustled through the underbrush around her. Voices, distant but real, human voices, low and easy, the sound of people who had no idea anything was wrong anywhere nearby. She froze at the edge of a small clearing, straining to place the direction, and caught a flicker of orange light through the trees ahead, unmistakably a campfire, its glow flickering against low branches perhaps a quarter-mile further north than she had ever dared to travel before. Her first instinct was to run straight toward it, to burst into that circle of firelight shouting for help. Her second, more careful thought, the one she had trained into herself over these long, hard nights, told her to slow down and think. If Daniel found her shouting at strangers, there was no telling what he might do, not to her. She did not truly believe he would hurt her directly, not after everything he had told her, but to whoever she dragged into this. She did not want anyone else's safety weighed against her own escape. She approached carefully instead, staying low, moving between trees rather than across open ground, until she could see the camp clearly. Two people sat near the fire, a man in his 50s, with a gray beard, and a woman, perhaps a decade younger, both dressed in serious hiking gear. A small tent pitched behind them, the kind of setup that suggested people who came into these woods often and knew, at least in general terms, how to take care of themselves out here. Claire hesitated at the edge of the firelight for a long moment, weighing every possible outcome, before finally stepping forward, careful to keep her voice low. "Please," she said, and the word came out cracked and desperate despite her best efforts to sound calm. "I need help." Both hikers startled, the man reaching instinctively for a walking stick propped against a nearby log, until he got a clear look at her. Torn clothes, scratched arms, the hollow, exhausted look that must have been written plainly across her face. "My God," the woman said, rising quickly. "Are you hurt? What happened to you?" Claire told them as much as she could in the space of a few frantic, whispered sentences, aware the whole time that every second she spent talking was a second Daniel might be closing the distance between them. The man, whose name she learned was Peter, listened with a grim, focused expression, already reaching for a phone from his jacket pocket. "No signal out here," he said after a moment, checking the screen with obvious frustration. "There's a ranger station about 6 miles east, though. If we head there now, we could—" "He'll find us before we get anywhere," Claire said, cutting him off, her eyes darting toward the tree line behind her. "He knows this whole forest, every trail, every shortcut. If I run with you, straight for a station 6 miles away, he'll catch us long before we're halfway there." The woman, whose name was Margaret, though not the sister Claire had thought of so often these past 12 nights, exchanged a quick, worried look with Peter, and Claire understood in that glance that they believed her completely, not because of anything she had proven, but because no one invents a story like this on the spot, with fear this raw written across every word. "Then what do you want us to do?" Peter asked. Claire thought fast, drawing on every piece of the forest she had learned over the past 12 nights. Every pattern of Daniel's searches, every gap in his knowledge, she had painstakingly mapped in secret. An idea began to take shape, rough and dangerous, but real. "Not tonight," she said. "If I try to run with you right now, and he finds us together, I don't know what he'll do, and I won't risk that. But if you can remember where this camp is, if you can be here again in a few nights, I think I can get here on my own, faster, with a real head start, and from here, you could get me to that ranger station, before he ever catches up." "A few nights," Margaret repeated, clearly unhappy with the idea of leaving Claire alone in these woods for even 1 more hour, let alone several more days. "Absolutely not. We should go for help right now." "If you go for help right now," Claire said, forcing steadiness into her voice, "it will take hours to reach that station, more hours to organize any kind of search, and by the time anyone comes back into these woods, looking for a cabin they don't know exists, in territory this vast, he'll have moved me, or covered every trace, or worse. I've seen how careful he is. I need you here, ready to move fast the moment I reach you, not searching for me across 11 miles of forest with no idea where to start." Peter studied her for a long moment, weighing the plan with the seriousness of a man who clearly understood, in some practical way, what she was asking of them. "3 nights, he finally said. "We'll be here, right here, 3 nights from now, and every night after that until you come, or until we decide we have to go for help regardless. But Claire, if you don't show up by the 4th night, we're not waiting any longer. We're getting rangers into these woods with everything they've got, whether that puts you at more risk or not." 3 nights, Claire agreed, relief and terror tangled together so tightly in her chest she could barely breathe. "Thank you. Thank you both, more than I can say." She left the small circle of firelight, with a plan taking shape in her mind for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun. A plan built not on blind panic or simple endurance, but on every hard lesson these 12 nights had taught her. And as she turned to begin the long, careful trek back toward the cabin, before Daniel's search could bring him anywhere near that campsite, she allowed herself, for the first time, to truly believe that an end to this might finally be within reach. Behind her, unseen in the deep shadow of the trees, a figure stood motionless for a long moment, before melting silently back into the dark, having watched the entire exchange from a distance too far for voices to carry. but close enough to understand exactly what had just been set into motion. Daniel found her 20 minutes later than usual that night, and when he did, something in his manner had changed in a way she could not immediately name. He said nothing about the campsite, nothing about voices or firelight, but his eyes lingered on her a beat too long as they walked back through the dark together, and Claire spent the entire walk certain, with a cold, sinking dread, that he somehow knew exactly what she had done. "You're quiet tonight," he finally said when they were nearly back to the cabin. "I'm tired," Claire answered, keeping her voice as even as she could manage.
"You seem different," he said.
"Not tired, something else." She said nothing, afraid that any further words might betray more than she intended, and Daniel did not push the point, though she caught him watching her more closely over the following days than he had at any point since the very first night. He began varying his own routine in small ways, leaving for town at unpredictable times, walking the perimeter of the cabin in the early mornings, as though checking for something out of place, and Claire understood, with growing unease, that whatever he suspected, he was no longer simply waiting for the nights to unfold on their usual schedule. She could not risk telling him anything, and she could not risk changing her own behavior too obviously either, so she forced herself through 2 more nights of ordinary running, familiar patterns, familiar directions, careful never once to head toward the campsite, where Peter and Margaret would be waiting. She hated every wasted night, every hour that ticked past bringing her closer to the deadline she herself had set, but she understood that arriving at that fire circle with Daniel's suspicion fully awakened would be far more dangerous than arriving a day or two behind schedule. On the second of those 2 nights, something happened that changed her calculations entirely. She was moving quietly along the edge of the ridge trail, well past midnight, when she heard Daniel's footsteps approaching from an unexpected direction, not the usual careful, patient tread she had come to recognize, but something faster, more urgent. She had barely enough time to duck behind a wide tree trunk before he passed close by, moving north, in the exact direction of the campsite, at a pace far quicker than any search he had ever conducted before. Her blood went cold. He knew. Somehow, someway, he had learned enough to guess where her true escape plan was aimed, and he was moving now not to find her wandering the woods at random, but to intercept whatever arrangement she had made. She had 2 choices in that frozen, terrible moment. She could stay hidden, let him continue north, and hope that Peter and Margaret were careful enough, far enough from any trail he knew, to avoid discovery. Or she could do something far riskier, something that broke every rule of caution she had built over these past weeks, and follow him, close enough to see what he intended, so that whatever happened next, she would not be blind to it. She chose to follow. She stayed well back, moving as quietly as her exhausted body would allow, using every skill these long nights had taught her, until the faint orange glow of the campfire came into view once more, smaller now, banked down for the night, with Peter's tent a dark shape against the trees, and Margaret's silhouette visible near the coals, apparently taking a turn at watch. Daniel stopped at the edge of the tree line, watching the small camp from a distance, and for a long, agonizing stretch of time, he simply stood there, motionless, giving no sign of what he intended to do next. Claire held her breath in the darkness behind him, close enough now that a single misplaced footstep could give her away, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man, weighing a decision with consequences he did not fully understand himself. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away from the camp entirely, back into the deeper trees, away from Peter and Margaret both. And Claire, watching from her hiding place, felt confusion mingling with her relief. He had found the camp. He had clearly suspected exactly what it meant. And he had chosen, for reasons she could not yet explain, to leave it undisturbed. She waited until he was well out of earshot before making her own careful way back toward the cabin, arriving just ahead of him, slipping through the door and onto the narrow bed, moments before his own footsteps sounded on the porch. When he came inside, he said nothing about where his search had taken him that night, and neither did she, though the unspoken knowledge sat heavy in the small room between them, an understanding neither was yet ready to name aloud. Lying awake long after his breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep across the room, Claire turned the night's events over and over in her mind, searching for the meaning behind his choice. He could have ended everything right there, could have confronted Peter and Margaret, could have moved the entire arrangement to some new, unknown location before she ever had the chance to reach them again. Instead, he had simply walked away, leaving her plan intact, leaving her chance at the road still open. Perhaps, she thought, staring up at the dark ceiling, he truly did want her to win. In whatever broken, complicated way a man like him was capable of wanting anything. Perhaps some part of him, buried beneath years of guilt and grief, and rules he had built to punish himself as much as anyone he had ever brought into these woods, was quietly, desperately hoping that this time, finally, the forest would lose. Whatever the reason, Claire understood one thing with absolute clarity, as the third night of her deadline drew closer. She would have only one real chance to reach that campsite and disappear into the trees toward the ranger station beyond it, and she intended to make certain, whatever it cost her, that this chance would be the last night she ever spent running through these woods at all. The third night arrived with a storm building on the horizon, thick clouds rolling in from the west that blotted out the moon entirely and turned the forest into a black, featureless void, even more disorienting than usual. Claire stood at the open door as evening fell, watching lightning flicker silently far in the distance, and understood that the weather could work either for her or against her, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. "Bad night for running," Daniel said from behind her, his voice carrying an odd weight she had not heard before. "You could wait until tomorrow." "No," Claire said, turning to look at him. "Tonight." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding neither one spoke aloud, and Daniel simply nodded once, stepping back from the doorway to let her pass. "Then go," he said. "And Claire, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know, I meant what I said, about wanting this to be possible." She did not answer him. She stepped out into the growing wind, and ran. The storm broke within the first 30 minutes, rain hammering down through gaps in the canopy hard enough to sting her skin, turning the ground beneath her feet into a treacherous slick of mud and slippery roots. She pressed north anyway, using landmarks she had memorized so thoroughly over these past weeks that even the storm's chaos could not fully erase them from her mind. The particular lean of a lightning-scarred pine, the sound of a small stream she needed to cross before turning further east toward the ridge trail. Behind her, she could hear nothing over the roar of the storm, no footsteps, no indication of how close or far Daniel might be, and that silence terrified her more than any sound of pursuit ever had. She pushed harder, driven by the desperate knowledge that this was her last chance, that Peter and Margaret would not wait past tonight, that whatever happened in these next few hours would determine everything. She reached the stream and found it swollen with rainwater, moving faster and higher than she had ever seen it. The crossing she had used on previous nights, now submerged under a rushing current that looked far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She hesitated at the bank, lightning briefly illuminating the churning water, and understood she had no real choice. Going around would cost precious time she did not have. She stepped into the current. The water hit her legs like a wall, cold and violent, nearly sweeping her feet out from under her within the first few steps. She fought her way across inch by inch, one hand gripping a low branch overhanging the far bank, until finally she hauled herself up onto solid ground, soaked through and shaking, but across. It was there, climbing up the muddy bank on the far side, that she heard him. "Claire." His voice cut through the storm, closer than she had expected, coming from somewhere behind and to her left, and she froze for half a second, before forcing herself to keep moving, scrambling up through wet brush, toward the ridge trail she knew lay just ahead. She could hear him behind her now, moving faster than his usual careful, patient pace, crashing through the storm with an urgency that told her he was no longer simply testing her. He was closing the distance as fast as the forest would allow. She reached the ridge trail and turned north along it, lungs burning, legs screaming with every stride, the campsite's remembered location pulling her forward like a lifeline. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the trail ahead of her in a brief, stark flash of white light, and in that instant she saw it, the faint orange glow of a fire through the trees, banked low against the storm but still burning, still there, exactly where it was supposed to be. "Claire, wait." Daniel's voice was close now, close enough that she could hear the strain in it, and she risked a glance back over her shoulder to see him emerging from the trees behind her, no longer walking with his usual unhurried patience but running, actually running, his face lit for a fraction of a second by another flash of lightning, an expression on it that looked less like a hunter closing in on prey, and more like a man terrified of what he was about to lose. She did not slow down. She could not afford to. Not when the fire's glow was so close now, close enough that she could hear voices shouting over the storm, Peter's voice, and Margaret's, both of them awake, both of them already moving toward the sound of her approach. She broke through the last stand of trees into the small clearing at a dead sprint, and Peter caught her by the shoulders as she nearly collapsed, half from exhaustion, and half from the sheer disbelief of having actually made it this far. Margaret was already moving, grabbing packs, pulling up tent stakes with the efficient speed of someone who had clearly spent the last 3 nights preparing exactly for this moment. Daniel emerged from the tree line seconds later, stopping at the edge of the clearing, rain streaming down his face, chest heaving from the run, and for a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Peter stepped in front of Claire instinctively, and Margaret's hand went to the small canister of bear spray clipped to her belt, but Daniel made no move toward any of them. He simply stood there, staring at Claire across the small clearing, and something in his expression, exhausted and stripped of all its usual calm, looked almost like relief. "Go," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The ranger station. 6 miles east. Go now, before I change my mind about any of this." "Why?" Claire said, unable to stop herself from asking. "Even now, even with freedom finally within reach. Why let me go now, after everything?" "Because you earned it," Daniel said. And for just a moment, the grief she had glimpsed once before, in the shape of an old photograph and a faded newspaper clipping, rose fully to the surface of his face. "You did what no one else ever could. That has to mean something. It has to." Peter was already pulling her toward the trail east, urgency overriding every other instinct, and Claire allowed herself to be pulled, though she kept her eyes on Daniel until the trees finally closed between them, swallowing his rain-soaked silhouette into the dark storm behind her. They ran together through the last hours of that storm, 3 figures moving as fast as the treacherous ground allowed, following a route Peter had scouted carefully over the preceding days, and though Claire's body screamed with every step, though exhaustion pulled at her with a weight she had never known before, she did not slow down. Not once. Not until the trees finally began to thin ahead of them, and a pale strip of gravel road appeared through the last curtain of rain, empty and gray, and more beautiful than anything she had ever seen in her life. Claire stepped onto the gravel road and stopped, standing perfectly still in the pouring rain, feeling the solid, unyielding surface of pavement beneath her feet for the first time, in what felt like an entire lifetime, rather than a matter of weeks. Peter and Margaret waited beside her, both of them breathing hard, both of them watching her with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph, but Claire barely noticed either of them in that first suspended moment. She simply stood in the rain, staring down at the ground, at the ordinary gray gravel that represented every hope she had carried through every single one of those long, terrifying nights. "We need to keep moving," Margaret finally said gently, touching her arm. "The station's not far now." "You did it, Claire. You actually did it." The words did not fully register until they were already walking again, the 3 of them moving at a slower, steadier pace now that the road stretched open and visible ahead of them. No trees to hide her, no forest to swallow her steps. The storm began to ease as they walked, the worst of the rain passing on toward some other stretch of sky, and by the time the small ranger station finally came into view, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the gray dawn light, Claire found herself crying, without quite understanding when the tears had started. Relief and exhaustion, and something close to disbelief, all tangled together into something she could not name. The ranger who met them at the door, a steady, capable woman who introduced herself as she wrapped a blanket around Claire's shoulders, listened to the whole story with a growing, focused seriousness, already reaching for a radio, before Claire had even finished her first sentence. Within the hour, vehicles were arriving, official ones, uniforms, radios crackling with coordinates and instructions, an entire machinery of response setting into motion that Claire could barely process through her exhaustion. She gave her account of everything as clearly as she could manage: the cabin, the nightly runs, the wooden box with its old photograph and yellowed clipping, and watched the faces around her shift from professional calm into something more urgent as the details accumulated, as someone in the room recognized, from her description of the newspaper clipping, a case that had gone cold, years before her own disappearance had even begun. The search teams found the cabin 2 days later, exactly where Claire's directions, drawn from weeks of careful, secret mapping, said it would be. They found the wooden box exactly where she had left it. They did not find Daniel. He was gone by the time anyone reached the clearing, the cabin left standing empty and undisturbed. No sign of struggle, no sign of hurried departure, simply a door left open to the forest, the same door that had opened for Claire every night of her captivity, now standing open for no one at all. Whatever had happened to him after that storm, after watching her disappear into the trees toward the road that had eluded so many before her, remained unknown, a question that lingered, unanswered, in every report filed and every interview conducted in the weeks that followed. Claire spent those weeks slowly rebuilding the ordinary shape of her life, reunited with her sister Margaret, who had spent every single day of her disappearance, searching, calling, refusing to accept the silence that had swallowed her sister so completely. The reunion, when it finally came, was long and tearful, and entirely without words for the first several minutes, simply two sisters holding on to each other in a hospital hallway, relearning the plain, ordinary miracle of each other's presence. The investigation into the old case, the one hinted at in that faded clipping, slowly gathered new life in the months that followed, detectives revisiting evidence long since filed away, following threads that Claire's testimony had finally given them the means to pull. She learned, eventually, that there had been others before her, exactly as she had feared, though she never learned all their names, and some part of her carried that unfinished knowledge with her, long after the physical marks of her ordeal had faded. But she also carried something else forward from those long, terrible nights in the forest, something she had not expected to find inside herself before any of this began. A steadiness, a capacity for patience and careful thought, even in the grip of overwhelming fear, forged night after night in the dark, learned one hard lesson at a time, until it had become simply a part of who she was. Months later, on a quiet evening with Margaret in the small apartment Claire had finally returned to, she found herself standing at the window, looking out at an ordinary city street, streetlights glowing steady and unbroken against the dark, no trees pressing in from every side, no uncertain ground waiting to catch her feet. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, about the forest she had left behind, about the man who had built an entire twisted world of rules and grief and desperate hope out of 11 miles of ancient trees, and about the particular, hard-won knowledge that she had carried out of those woods with her when she finally, truly, walked free. She did not know, standing there in the safety of her own ordinary life, whether Daniel was still out there somewhere, still walking those same trails alone now, still listening for footsteps that would never come again. She did not know whether the forest had finally caught up with him the way it had caught up with so many others before her, or whether he had simply vanished into some entirely different life, carrying his own unanswered grief with him wherever he had gone. What she knew, with a certainty that had settled deep into her bones somewhere during those long, dark nights of running, was that she had faced the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she had not simply survived it. She had learned it, mapped it, outthought it, and finally, on a stormy night with lightning splitting the sky above her, she had walked out of it entirely, on her own 2 feet. And that, more than any single night's escape, was the story she chose, in the end, to carry forward.